Watch It Burn and Rust by Delimeville. Chapter 2, Reaching Out. The next time the human approached directly, it was when Patton was awake, and hence completely alarmed at the unexpected change in routine. He scuttled backwards as close to the ground as he could manage and choked out a stuttered apology in his own language despite knowing the human wouldn't understand. Surprisingly, though, the human came to a stop a few feet away, going still at his panicked motions. Patton took a moment to fret over possibly triggering the human's prey drive before the being in question crouched, peering at Patton intently before holding up the cloth he normally had wrapped around himself. Patton straightened up slightly, head tilted in bewilderment. The crouch hadn't been predatory, simply a way to reduce the distance between them, and he thought he had a good enough grip on the human's expressions to tell that he wasn't angry, so what was he trying to communicate? The human swallowed, and after a few false starts, actually spoke. "Hide," he rasped out in broken common, lifting the cloth further. "Hide." Patton stared with wide eyes, and the human looked over his shoulder, brow furrowed. Patton followed his gaze to the cell door. "Hide, bad guards," the human said, voice taking on a more desperate tint. He headed back toward his corner, and then turned to stare at Patton imploringly. He patted the ground, beckoning the other over to the darker corner. Patton strained his ears. He might have been imagining it, but it seemed like the human had heard the telltale footsteps of their captors approaching again. He scrambled to his feet and then wobbled as spots danced before his eyes. He was bone-tired, and running towards a human was the last thing one should do, but what did he really have to lose at this point? He definitely could hear footsteps in the corridor now, and quickly hurried over to the human, who gave his short, low sigh of relief. He draped the cloth over Patton, muttering nervously in common so stilted Patton almost couldn't understand. Even the words he could make out were hard to grasp, the sentences nearly nonsensical. "Hide you. Hide you. Fight. Human fight guards. Sorry." As soon as he was settled under the fabric, the human placed a finger to his lips in a gesture Patton didn't recognize, and hurried to the side of the door. Patton ducked his head down belatedly, watching tensely as the footsteps grew closer. The door swung open, and the human flung himself at the first guard a heartbeat later, tearing at the protective suit they were wearing. Patton whistled softly in shock, but luckily the sound was lost in the yelling of all the others, including the human, who was making a heavy, hoarse yell of anger. The guard folded like a house of cards under the blows, but before they hit the ground, the one behind them was jabbing out with the crackling rod. As soon as it made contact with Patton's human, his howl rose in volume, becoming a shriek of pain, and he spasmed once before collapsing. Patton's hearts felt like they were going to race right out of him, and he only barely managed to stay hidden as the human met his gaze from across the cell. His eyes were clear of the haze of fury or terror, instead looking calm and almost resigned. He hissed through his teeth, but didn't attack again when one of the braver guards kicked at him, distracting him long enough for the other to slap another one of those patches on him. It took longer for them to leave with one guard so clearly injured, but before long Patton was left alone once more. His head reeled from all the new information. The human had been hiding him from the guards, both now and before, using the dark garment that let him stay near invisible in the shadows. Why? Patton wasn't useful to the human, couldn't provide anything. All he did was take up space, sleeping in his corner. There was no evidence that the human was planning anything malicious at all through keeping him hidden from the guards, which could only mean that the human was protecting him. He could almost hear his shipmates' voices in his head, telling him not to get too far ahead of himself, but he was already astonished at the very idea. The human using his own things to hide him, starting a fight he didn't intend to win to draw the guards' attention from him, the way he left half the food out for Patton even though his appetite had been waning as his illness progressed. Viewed through the lens of the human trying to keep him safe, they all made sense. He curled up further in the fabric, wondering if maybe the human would let him take some energy. He'd been too stunned to speak earlier, but the fact that the human knew basic common was a good sign. They could communicate if the human was willing. Ages later, the human was finally returned, in considerably worse shape. Patton hurried out from his hiding spot, knowing that if he still had his outer feathers, they'd be bristling with alarm. The human was sprawled out on the floor, limbs shaking as he choked out pained breaths, neck spasming and bumping his head painfully against the ground. Whatever the human was drugged with, it clearly didn't involve painkillers. Every exhale a pitiful whine of agony. His eyes were dilated and unfocused, and everything in Patton screamed at him that this was dangerous. He needed to get away, but this was his human now. He might have even gotten more hurt than before because he was protecting Patton. He couldn't just leave him alone in pain. He crept forwards, carrying the human's covering with him, and carefully pushed it around his head, cushioning it from the hard ground below. The human barely seemed to notice as Patton set a proper barrier between him and the human. It was tempting, so tempting, to try and take energy, but he didn't know anything about humans. Some species took to Ampen's feeding habits better than others. Trying to take the human's energy while he was injured could worsen his state or prevent him from healing right, which was the opposite of what Patton wanted. Instead, he carefully curled himself around the hoodie and, by extension, the human's head, keeping it from jerking around as he shook. The human was still making those soft noises of pain with every breath, and Patton began to make the soft chirp and coo pattern that he used to soothe panicked kits. He didn't know if it helped, but after what seemed like an eternity, the human seemed to finally settle into unconsciousness. Patton moved the cloth to drape over his bared skin the way he normally wore it, wishing he knew more about how humans worked. He couldn't tell if his human was just resting to heal or if he was seriously injured, and he wouldn't know until the other woke. If the other woke. He settled into his corner to wait, watching the mystifyingly slow rise and fall of his chest, hoping that the human would pull through. He'd been on the brink of dozing when the human finally came to. He woke without any sound, which was a bit eerie, seeing as Patton could tell his movements were all super clearly painful. Then again, waking up silent no matter what would probably help when one lived on a death world. Honestly, it was a miracle Patton himself hadn't been considered a hostile with paranoia like that. The human sat up, wincing as he went. He mumbled something in his own language, rubbing at his neck tiredly, and then blinking once he noticed Patton was awake and looking at him. Immediately he became more tense, eyes widening. Patton drooped his antennae, making himself smaller, but didn't look away. "Are you okay? Still hurt?" he chirped in common, keeping his voice low. The human jerked back slightly, and then bared his teeth, eyes slightly wild. "Talk? You talk?" Oh no, 5 words in and he'd already upset him. He flattened himself to the floor. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend." The human dropped his expression, pressing his lips together with a sound of realization. No, sorry." He pulled a lip up, showing his teeth slightly. "No bad. Human—" He made a gesture with his hands. "Not bad? Good?" Patton echoed. You aren't mad?" The human nodded, keeping his teeth concealed this time. As Patton kept talking, though, his expression dimmed slightly. "No," he said a few words in human and gestured to his mouth, frustrated. "Bad." "You can't speak common well?" Patton imitated the human's nod. "It's okay. You need sleep. Rest and help your injuries. Stop hurting." When the human seemed hesitant, Patton curled up himself, miming resting. "It's okay. I'll sleep too. Talk after rest?" His human nodded slowly, and Patton fell asleep before the human had even finished settling down. Heavy, gloved hands holding him down, tearing at his coat and leaving trails of fiery pain behind. He twists and struggles to get free, but there's no energy left in him, and he's only hurt more as punishment. That doesn't matter, though, because he can see the cages not too far away, can see his shipmates locked inside, knows deep down that it's his fault they were found, captured. Please let them go. He'll do anything. He'll stay and be good, please. Even as he watches, they're attacked by the guards' crackling rods, crying out for help. He thrashes and screams, but he can't escape, can only watch as they're taken away from him. He woke up with a cry, and the low, crooning sobs tore through him uncontrollably. He missed them so much. He wondered if they were still looking for him, if Roman was being reckless, Logan losing sleep. Who was going to take care of them now that he was gone? Something moved in the corner of his vision, and he jerked his head up, heart rate increasing as a large figure draped in shadow moved closer. Dizziness overwhelmed his senses, his vision blurring. A small part of him recognized the shape, but more of him was seeing the guards in their dark suits coming back for him to take everything from him. A small, familiar pattern sounded softly by him, pulling him from his spiral slowly but surely. Guards didn't make that sound. It was a chirp and a coo, repeated softly to soothe those in distress. He'd used it before on the human. He slowly lifted his head, seeing the large figure closer than he had expected, but also smaller? The human had laid down flat on his front, he realized, mimicking the flattening that Patton always did to be non-threatening. He'd made himself smaller and was still mimicking that gentle pattern, eyes lowered. He remembered when Patton had soothed him. He was trying to help. Patton felt his heart swell, letting out a nonsense string of thank yous and apologies in his own language on the edge of tears. The human repeated the pattern a bit more urgently, probably mistaking his joy for upset, and Patton finally set one small, clawed hand on top of the human's sleeved arm. "Thank you, human." The human sighed in relief at the common, and then seemed to blink in astonishment once he realized what had been said. "Virgil," he blurted, and Patton blinked, trying to figure out if that was common. The human pointed at himself, face turning slightly red. "Virgil. Virgil." Patton perked up. "Oh! That's your name? I'm Patton." Virgil stared, processing, and Patton pointed at himself to make it easier. "Patton." "Patton?" Virgil imitated the clicks that made up his name, and then bared his teeth again. Not bad, Patton remembered. A happy human expression? He wiggled in his own form of excitement. Virgil sat up slightly, hesitating for a long moment, and then reached a hand out. For a second, Patton saw the past instead of the present, felt panic rattling in his bones, but it was just Virgil. Just his strange, kind human. He reached out with his own hand, marveling at how different they were in size, and gently grabbed on. Immediately he felt a bright, strong energy, the kind that would have turned heads in any amp in town. His body felt lighter, less burdened by the artificial gravity, and he couldn't help but chirp in delight and practically throw himself at Virgil. There was a small oomph, and then for a moment, Patton worried about overstepping, but then hands hesitantly rose to support him, cuddling him lightly against the human's chest. The human ran hot, and he vibrated with happiness as the cold, aching feeling in him melted away. He'd gotten so used to feeling empty all this time, and now he was whole, energy returning to him as though it had never left. Virgil shifted, leaning against the wall and running his fingers gently along Patton's back, the slightest touch. It was nothing like what the smugglers had done, nothing like what anyone would expect of a Death Worlder. And for the first time since he'd been captured, Patton felt safe.